Hey, what is going on, guys? So welcome to part 2 of my debunk of what I've learned video titled Vegan Diets Don't Work. Here's why. If you haven't seen part 1 of my response to his video, I highly recommend you watch it before watching this one because I'll be referring to it a couple times here and there. However, you don't really need to watch it in order to understand how bad his video is upon finishing this video. So that's really just up to you. Before we start the actual debunk, there's 2 things I want to say. First off, I got to thank Beans once again for his just huge amount of help in developing the script for this video and doing some of the research with me, as well as Matthew Medor, Matthew Nagra, Nutrivore, who by the way has a much more comprehensive debunk on the way. Look out for that. And I also want to mention Dominic Beast from the East and they're all from Nutrivore's Discord server.
As Michael Pollan has argued in his book Defense of Food, we frequently fall victim to this concept of nutritionism, that we don't necessarily need whole foods, we just need their components. But certain supplements illustrate how it's a lot more complex than that.
So this part is a little confusing. It is true that we need specific components of whole foods and not whole foods per se. Nobody is falling victim to this concept if it is literally true. And even if we accepted the notion that certain supplements don't work, which to be clear, he has not demonstrated that thus far in this video, how would that show that it isn't specific nutrients that we need as opposed to whole foods? All it would show is that supplements aren't always good at getting people specific nutrients. Accepting this as true does not commit somebody to thinking that we need whole foods instead of nutrients.
According to a 2012 study, despite taking prenatal supplements, 58% of pregnant women had iron levels below normal.
So what's funny about the study that what I've learned is citing here is that the women also ate meat. If I wanted to, I could say, despite eating meat, 58% of pregnant women had iron levels below normal. Therefore, heme iron found in meat is not bioavailable. What I've learned also said that despite taking prenatal supplements, 58% of women had iron levels below normal. This is misleading considering that the study is on 19 pregnant women. This is not enough of a sample size to justify extrapolating this data onto the population of pregnant women taking prenatal supplements as a whole. And here's something else. The study's objective was to better characterize placental iron transport through giving 19 pregnant women iron supplements. And if you don't know, placental iron transport is when iron is transported from the mother to the fetus across the placenta. This study did not seek to investigate the prevalence of iron deficiency among pregnant women who take prenatal supplements. So what about a study with a much larger sample size of 43,274 women whose goal is to determine the effect of iron supplementation on maternal anemia and iron deficiency? Well, here is a meta-analysis with this goal, and their findings were supplementation reduces the risk of maternal anemia and iron deficiency in pregnancy, but the positive effect on other maternal and infant outcomes is less clear. Implementation of iron supplementation recommendations may produce heterogeneous results depending on the population's background risk for low birth weight and anemia, as well as the level of adherence to the intervention. Now, if you've seen part 1 of my debunk, I want you to also think about this. This incidence of what I've learned using low quality data to justify claims is very similar to what I covered in part 1, where he tried to lend credence to the notion that eating zero fiber can help resolve constipation. He cited a paper on 63 people with a load of limitations, rather than papers much more properly designed with sample sizes of 14,024, 3,327, and 15,000. In this case, in order to make the case that iron supplements may not sufficiently work with pregnant women, he cites a paper studying 19 pregnant people whose objective didn't even support his claim, rather than look at a paper with 43,274 women, which actually aimed to investigate his claim. And what's worse about all this is that he does this while trying to come across as this objective person who's just looking at the highest quality evidence to see what's true. He is not that person.
Choline is a critical nutrient for brain function, and one study estimates 90% of Americans aren't getting enough.
So, while it is true that choline is essential, and his study does estimate that 90% of Americans fall short of the adequate intake, it's important to read what the authors themselves say about the adequate intake value used in this paper. The paper says, current intakes cannot be deemed inadequate based upon the adequate intake value alone. Although adequate intakes may be useful in guiding individual dietary plans, by definition, they are established when evidence is insufficient to calculate an estimated average requirement. Therefore, it is not possible to conclusively assess the risk of inadequacy in a population. Future research will be critical for establishing an estimated average requirement to assess the risk for inadequacy within subgroups of the population. In other words, there is insufficient evidence to establish an estimated average requirement for choline. So for now, an adequate intake value is used instead and that is what the 90% estimate claim is based on. So rather than let us know this detail, What I've Learned decides to represent the findings of the study as if it found that 90% of Americans are not meeting the average daily requirement for choline when no such thing currently exists.
A 2019 study found choline from egg yolks to be far better absorbed than choline from the common supplement choline bitartrate. Just 150 calories of egg yolk will give you over 100% of your requirement.
So choline absorption from eggs is high. I'm not going to argue with that. But as I always say on this channel, we have to actually look at health outcomes rather than just, get scared about the potential negative health effects of not consuming a certain food. So let's look at some health outcomes. It should be understood that one of the main concerns with choline deficiency is non-alcoholic liver disease. With this info, if low choline intake is an issue for vegans, we would expect to see a positive correlation between higher adherence to plant-based diets and non-alcoholic liver disease, and an inverse correlation between consumption of animal foods and non-alcoholic liver disease. So let's look at some outcomes. This paper found that higher adherence to plant-based diets, especially healthful plant-based diets, is associated with a lower likelihood of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this paper had similar findings. And here's a paper looking at the association between 4 different dietary patterns and risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The 4 dietary patterns were: number 1, traditional Chinese; number 2, animal food; number 3, grains, vegetables; and number 4, high salt. Also understand that the animal food dietary pattern contained high consumption of animal foods, including eggs. And straight from the discussion, further analysis showed that food consumption in the animal food dietary pattern was associated with an increased risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the grains vegetables dietary pattern was associated with a decreased risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And just one more study, but with a smaller sample size, which I guess doesn't really matter for What I've Learned because he cites studies with very small sample sizes as well. This pilot study with 26 non-alcoholic fatty liver disease patients who consumed a vegan diet for 6 months had 20 of them normalize their liver function tests, independently of their improvements in body weight.
One study found that while dietary calcium reduced the risk of heart attack, calcium supplements increased the risk. Calcium can be hard for vegans to get enough of without supplementation.
So when I go back to What I've Learned Substack for this claim, there's no source for it. But anyway, this paper found a 14% reduction in risk for cardiovascular disease mortality when you go from less than 1 serving of tofu per month to more than 1 serving of tofu per week. And similar reductions were found for soy milk. Both of these foods either contain calcium fortification or have added calcium. What I've Learned follows his basis claim up with saying that getting calcium on a vegan diet is difficult without supplementation. Now let's think about this for a second. Even if I accepted this as true, why does it matter? Let's pretend there was no such thing as naturally occurring calcium from plant foods and that vegans had to rely on fortified soy milks and other vegan products to get sufficient calcium. Why would I care? This is pretty much true about B12, and I accept that we should supplement. Of course, What I've Learned would say that I should care because of the paper he didn't cite which said that calcium supplements increase risk of a heart attack. Something else you should know is that 250 grams of extra firm tofu gets you 937 milligrams of calcium. How is it apparently hard for vegans to get enough calcium without supplements when you take this into account? And to be clear, tofu is not supplemented with calcium. Calcium is added in the process of creating tofu because calcium is used for the coagulation process needed to create it. This is similar to how hard cheese gains K2 as a result of the fermentation process, which, by the way, he did mention hard cheese earlier as a source of K2. And remember earlier in part 1 where he was saying that people are eating carnivorous diets without any deficiencies? Well, here's the calcium intake from a full carnivore diet where people are only getting 18.5% of their RDA for calcium using 1,000 milligrams as the RDA. So let's look at actual data as opposed to just making claims without data when it comes to supplemental calcium and health outcomes. This systematic review and meta-analysis of observational studies found that supplemental calcium intake was associated with a decreased risk of all-cause mortality.
This 2020 study found vegans had weaker bones and a 43% higher risk for fractures than omnivores.
All right, guys, so there are so many issues with this paper. I've covered some of the main ones on my channel before, and I'm going to play that now. But understand that Dr. Avi has covered the study in even more depth. I strongly recommend you watch it later if you have the time. I'll have it linked in the description. Now, first off, there was zero consideration and therefore adjustment for vitamin D intake, which is obviously important to consider because low vitamin D intake is a strong risk factor for poor bone health. Secondly, the authors were not too transparent about what statistical tests they ran when adjusting for confounding factors, not even in the supplementary material of the paper. Now, we can infer by the way in which the authors describe particular categories of confounders that they used a stratification-based adjustment. Stratification just means the arrangement or classification of something into different groups. So an example of doing this in this paper could be taking, say, all the vegans and meat eaters with a BMI of 25. So you have a group of vegans with a BMI of 25 and a group of meat eaters with a BMI of 25. You do this so you don't have BMI vary between the two groups. You then calculate the relative risk of having, say, bone fractures between the two groups. This would be an example of a stratification-based adjustment when trying to adjust for BMI between the meat eating group and the vegan group. So one of the main issues with this paper is that they assume that the relationship between BMI and bone fracture risk is a linear one. This mistake was also made in regards to calcium intake and bone fracture risk. Both of these relationships are not linear. This led to a portion of the adjustment being on levels of BMI and calcium intake where we know that risk does not go up. So just pertaining to BMI and fracture risk, here's an example from Avi of a stratification-based adjustment in different areas that would have been more sensible to do. Oh, and here's some health outcomes of the vegans in that Oxford cohort from the previous study he just touched on about, bone mineral density, which what I've learned conveniently decided to leave out. There was a 19% lower risk of all cancers combined in vegans. There was lower ischemic heart disease, diverticular diseases, and cataracts.
I'm not saying all supplements are just bad. They indeed have been found to help people reach the appropriate intake of certain nutrients. I take some specific supplements myself. The point is there can be issues with relying on supplements.
When what I've learned says that the point he's trying to make is that, solely relying on supplements could be bad, he's saying this as though he has demonstrated this in his video. But the fact is that he hasn't. As you saw in part 1 of my response to him, he tried to see if B12 supplements work as well as animal foods by looking at 2 horrible papers, one of which included a population of vegans where 81% weren't supplementing, and a second study where the authors didn't adequately assess supplement intake. For iron supplements in pregnant women, he cited a study on 19 pregnant women with the goal of assessing better characterizing placental iron transport through giving 19 pregnant women iron supplements. And for calcium supplements, he just made a claim without a source. You can't just say, quote, the point is there could be issues with relying on supplements when you haven't sufficiently demonstrated what the problems with doing so are.
Let's rewind back to 1932. Dr. Francis Pottinger had been trying to formulate a healthy diet for his laboratory cats. He assumed he had all the components necessary for a proper cat diet: raw milk, cod liver, and cooked meat and organs. Yet, for some reason, his cats seemed to suffer from nutrient deficiencies. At some point, he had so many cats that he had to cut corners. He started giving some cats their meat raw. Within a few months, though, these raw meat-fed cats and their kittens were clearly healthier than the cooked meat-fed cats and kittens.
This is a raw meat animal with the full, round face. Notice the firm gingiva, the normal coloring tones, the beautiful broad mouth. A later examination of the skull showed a firmly developed zygomatic arch.
This prompted Pottinger to conduct a 10-year study to puzzle out the effect of cooked versus raw meat on hundreds of cats. He found that the cooked meat cats consistently had health problems, but the problems were even worse for their kittens.
The head has begun to flatten and is actually smaller than the comparable raw meat cat. The zygomatic arch is not completed. The nasal development is somewhat irregular. Dental deterioration was also common.
Their kittens were born underweight with brittle bones. Their teeth were crooked and crowded. They had allergies. Then, all these problems were even worse for their kittens.
Pronounced exhaustion was a typical observation among the 3rd generation of cooked meat kittens. The skull is considerably smaller. The bones are paper thin and soft like sponge rubber.
In fact, the 3rd generation of these cats didn't survive more than 6 months.
The cooked meat cats were unable to successfully reproduce after the 3rd generation.
So the thing is, initially, the deficient cat diet seemed not too terrible. Sure, the first cats had some problems, but the bigger problems started to appear in the kittens. Then the full picture of just how inappropriate this diet was appeared a generation later. By the way, there was some leeway. If the diet was at least 50% raw, then the cats developed well. But the point is not to say that we need to eat raw meat. We're not cats. The point is, it's not about what's natural. It's about track record. It's easy to observe the effect of a diet in cats quite quickly. In just 10 years, Pottinger got a grasp for the track record for these 2 cat diets. With humans, it takes far longer to see the generational impact of a diet. But whatever we've been eating the past couple decades already has a pretty bad track record. Like the cats, some markers of our health seems to be worse with each generation. Something about our modern environment is leading to all kinds of problems. Dr. Sandra Kahn and Paul Ehrlich have written a book called Jaws, The Hidden Epidemic, about the epidemic of small dental arches leading to crooked teeth and constricted airways. This then leads to breathing problems like sleep apnea that take a huge toll on health. There's been a tripling in peanut allergies. Prevalence of ADHD has steadily increased over the past 20 years. Incidence of depression in 12 to 25-year-olds has more than doubled since 2008.
How does anything he just said lend credence to the notion that vegan diets don't work? It's clear he is trying to illustrate through his cat story that data on the short term isn't necessarily going to inform us about long-term and generational outcomes from a specific diet. He then goes on to list things that have gone up over time, but we all know we can't attribute this to veganism because of how small the vegan population is. So while I understand the kind of point he's trying to make here, I fail to see how any of this supports the claim that vegan diets don't work. Perhaps he will provide health outcome data demonstrating that vegan diets cause generational issues and that therefore outcome data on vegans today should be viewed more cautiously. And yeah, he doesn't. Also, how desperate do you have to be to grasp at straws that you have to rely on cat studies?
But when it comes to diets, we know of one that has a good track record. Maybe you've heard of the term diseases of civilization, which refers to heart disease, cancer, osteoporosis, diabetes, and so on. Anthropologists could tell you that before agriculture came along, hunter-gatherers very rarely had any of these afflictions that are so common today. They also had robust skeletons and broad faces that allowed for straight, cavity-free teeth. If the dangers of living outdoors without the aid of modern medical care didn't kill them, they lived quite long and without chronic disease. As the name hunter-gatherer would suggest, all parts of fish and animals were very valued in their diet. In the late 1800s, Plains Indians were the tallest people in the world. And according to an anthropologist at Ohio State University, they had a remarkable record of nutritional and health success. They ate tons of wild game and bison and preserved what they couldn't fit in their stomachs as jerky or pemmican. They would even dry out bison stomachs and fill them with blood to drink when they were thirsty. While it does sound gross, they may have used it to hydrate because blood would provide electrolytes.
So what I've learned seems to be unaware of concepts like survivorship bias, which I've covered on my channel multiple times. Survivorship bias is a type of selection bias that can occur when those who did not survive a selection event or process are overlooked in favor of those who did survive. Here is Nutrivore putting this issue very well in an article he wrote on the topic. Many paleo diet advocates claim that hunter-gatherer diets optimally promote the long-term health of human beings. There are typically two primary justifications for this claim. Firstly, the fact that hunter-gatherer populations typically appear to be robustly healthy, and secondly, the fact that humans evolved eating these types of diets. While these are technically statements of fact, I find myself forced to take a page out of the paleo dieters playbook as I remind them that correlation doesn't equal causation, so let's dig into why their reasoning is flawed. Firstly, let me hit you with a thought experiment for a moment. Do you think that the elderly people within a given population would appear either more healthy or less healthy if that population never had access to modern medical technology? Think about this for a moment. You may understandably intuit that their health would probably be worse, correct? But that probably isn't what would happen. They would probably appear healthier, and I'll explain why. If a population never had access to modern medical technology, one of the things you couldn't reliably do is save sick or injured children. No matter what culture you observe, a sizable proportion of children will develop infectious illnesses. These illnesses, like bacterial or viral infections, are generally mundane by modern standards. However, without modern medicine, many children who develop these types of illnesses would likely not survive them. Those who are prone to illness likely do not have the same chances of survival as those who are less prone to illness. As such, why wouldn't the elderly in this hypothetical population present with more robust health as a result? Without medical intervention, the environment is essentially selecting for the fittest possible individuals in our hypothetical population. This would likely generate the appearance of more robust health in the elderly. Consider this carefully for a moment. If you weed out all of the weaker people, of course the remaining population is going to appear stronger. This presents a significant problem for paleo diet advocates who choose to cite the robust health of hunter-gatherer populations as a justification for the paleo diet, or as a justification for recommending the diet to others. Most paleo dieters do seem to be aware of the environmental adversity faced by hunter-gatherer populations, but they often don't seem to appreciate how this also produces significant changes for their narrative. For example, if you remind a paleo dieter that hunter-gatherers typically had an average life expectancy of around 30 years, they will often immediately retort by stating that those estimates are confounded by infant and child mortality. But therein lies the problem. They can't have it both ways. a paleo diet advocate cannot use that argument without tacitly admitting that infant and child mortality is typically enormously high among hunter-gatherer populations, which it most certainly is. Approximately 26.8% of infants and 48.8% of prepubescent children die in hunter-gatherer populations. With such a high proportion of children dying, how could it be the case that the apparent health of elderly hunter-gatherers is not colored by this? Remember, hunter-gatherer populations likely appear healthier because the least resilient members of those populations are already dead. Paleo diet advocates cannot admit that hunter-gatherer populations had high rates of infant and child mortality without also admitting that the resulting population is a heavily biased sample. This type of confounding is known as survivorship bias. Basically, survivorship bias is a type of selection bias that can occur when those who do not survive a selection event or process are overlooked in favor of those who did survive. For example, let's say we were trying to construct better body armor for soldiers to wear in combat. Perhaps we might conduct a study of soldiers who return from battle. We could collect bullet wound distribution pattern data to help ascertain where soldiers were most likely to get shot. However, as we see in the graphic above, this sort of analysis would exclude all those who were shot and did not survive. It would also overlook the sorts of bullet wound distribution patterns that tended to lead to death, which would actually have given us a significantly clearer picture of how we might construct better body armor. Likewise, when paleo diet advocates claim that we should eat like hunter-gatherers because hunter-gatherers are robustly healthy, they're not appreciating how survivorship bias is confounding their appraisal of hunter-gatherer health. They are essentially overlooking the other 50% of the hunter-gatherer population that didn't survive. For this reason, it is dubious to use the apparent good health of hunter-gatherers as the basis for the assumption that their diets are appropriate for modern humans. Until paleo diet advocates can figure out a way to explain why survivorship bias would not be confounding in an evaluation of hunter-gatherer health, they cannot rely on the apparent good health of hunter-gatherer populations to determine the applicability of hunter-gatherer diets to modern humans. In reality, the degree to which hunter-gatherer diets are appropriate for modern health remains unclear.
The anti-meat push has gotten so strong that, as investigative journalist Nina Teichels reveals, a Tufts University ranking system bogusly ranks Reese's peanut butter cups as healthier than eggs, cheese, or ground beef. And lightly salted potato chips have twice the score of ground beef, and chocolate-covered almonds have 3 times the score and are in the to be encouraged category.
All right, so to start, what I've learned is citing Nina Teichels as a source, and she is not very trustworthy.
On the rare occasion when she's asked, "What evidence do you have that meat is healthy?" she doesn't seem to have a compelling script.
Any evidence that you could cite that meat diets are healthier than plant-based diets?
The clinical trials on meat specifically are, there's 2 systematic reviews of clinical trials on meat that I know of that show that cardiovascular outcomes are improved. One of them looked at 0.5 ounces or servings of meat per day and showed increased benefits, cardiovascular benefits for eating the meat versus not eating the meat. And there is one other review on cardiovascular outcomes that also showed that meat was beneficial, looked better for cardiovascular outcomes.
When asked for evidence, she just says, these 2 systematic reviews. I'm not going to give you the name of them, but yeah, they exist. Yeah, for sure. But aside from how untrustworthy she is, when it comes to this chart, what I've learned is just misinterpreting the purpose of the Tufts University ranking system. Many of the pro-meat community, Joe Rogan included, share this misinterpretation when charts like this started spreading. Here is Matthew Nagra explaining how ridiculous this misinterpretation is in depth.
Joe Rogan is at it again. He recently shared this graph from a blog article by a meat delivery company suggesting that the Food Compass scoring system developed by researchers at Tufts University is recommending eating Lucky Charms cereal over beef. Well, that's not exactly true. The Food Compass scored over 8,000 foods based on 9 domains. These include the ratio of certain nutrients like saturated and unsaturated fats, the vitamin and mineral content, types of processing, food-based ingredients, additives, amounts of protein and fiber, amounts of specific types of fatty acids, and phytochemical content. However, based on the graph that Joe shared, this would score Lucky Charms higher than ground beef. Well, here's the issue. The chart isn't even from the Food Compass publication. It's from a response article to the Compass by authors who actually misinterpreted how it's meant to be used, and they just selected a bunch of values and threw them on a chart. In fact, here's one of the authors saying that's what they did. The Food Compass is meant to score foods within a given category. So within the category of fruits, whole fruits score very high, fruity desserts score very low. In the meat category, salmon scores very high, but hot dogs score very low. And in the dessert category, chocolate-covered almonds are scoring at the top, and pastries and churros are sitting at the bottom. So it is not suggesting that Lucky Charms are an alternative to beef. They're in two completely different categories. And amongst 50,000 Americans in the NHANES cohort, those with higher overall scores had a 24% higher odds of optimal cardiometabolic risk factors and a 7% lower risk of death due to all causes. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good.
And check this out straight from their website. Food Compass also includes many packaged and branded foods, so you can use scores to shop for healthier items within each category, such as higher scoring breakfast cereals. While Food Compass works well across thousands of products on average, scores may not be yet ideal to compare foods that play very different roles in the diet, such as protein-rich food like eggs, meat, or fish versus a carbohydrate-rich food like bread, pasta, rice, or potatoes. So what I've learned, like many of the meatheads online, are just misinterpreting the purpose of this ranking system. Amazing.
It's easy to assume that our understanding of individual nutrients is so advanced that we don't need to rely on outdated meat-based diets. We can make replacements. But while the amount of knowledge on nutrition that's been accumulated is incredible, is it as complete as we assume? In 1989, scientists decided that the standardized purified lab rat feed needed to include several seemingly random things like chromium, fluoride, boron, vanadium, arsenic, nickel, tin, lithium, and silicon. Why? Well, they didn't really know what these things did. They just observed that the rats didn't grow properly without them. In 1978, a 6-year-old girl was admitted to the hospital with a serious gunshot wound to the stomach. At the time, just how essential omega-3 fatty acids are wasn't fully understood. The liquefied nutrition they gave her was deficient in omega-3s, causing her to develop neurological symptoms like numbed legs and feet, drastic weakness, and blurred eyesight. It wasn't even until 1998 that the nutrient choline was recognized to be essential. Liver disease, heart disease, and neurological dysfunction taught us that choline is pretty important. A paper from just last year, in 2022, suggests that we underestimate the optimal intake of choline. This choline study found that 7-year-old children had better attention span if their mothers consumed twice the recommended amount of choline during their pregnancy.
All right, so here's an interesting finding. The paper he just cited from 2022, which he claims suggests we underestimate the optimal intake of choline, was on prenatal choline intake, not choline intake. Not to mention that the study was dependent on choline supplementation and found a benefit with the higher dose of it, which is a little funny to observe considering his earlier advocacy for eggs over choline supplements for sufficient choline. And it gets even more hilarious. To get the amount of choline in the higher supplement group, one would have to consume 7 medium eggs per day, which would be about a quarter of a pregnant woman's diet if we assume a 2,000 calorie intake. I think a supplement would be more preferable. And just another reminder that I'm not totally sure how any of this shows that vegan diets don't work. The fact is that rambling about all of the cases in which we clearly did not have a full understanding of nutrition is just to point out something that comes with all scientific endeavors related to understanding phenomena, which is that we are always seeking to develop a full understanding of whatever topic we are focused on understanding. And more often than not, we don't have a full understanding of these topics. I can just as easily ramble about us not having, all the information on nutrition when it comes to non-vegan diets and think maybe we're having too much of something in non-vegan diets or we're having too little of something. So maybe I should now make a video called Why Non-Vegan Diets Don't Work.
Finally, let's go back to 1865 when the first infant formula was invented. It took many decades for quality and regulations to improve, but eventually infant formula came to be widely regarded as a safe substitute for breast milk, leading to a significant decline in breastfeeding.
Pet milk is a safe milk for babies. So feed your baby the pet milk way.
Research has associated formula feeding with children more easily developing eczema, asthma, and food allergies, as well as diabetes and obesity. A 2008 study found breastfed babies to have 5-point higher IQ. Today, the AAP, WHO, and UNICEF all recommend exclusive breastfeeding for at least the first 6 months of life.
So here's a paper showing that babies fed formula had higher lean body mass. And here's another paper showing that babies fed formula were taller. Now, why is this interesting? Later in his video, you're gonna see that what I've learned implies that vegan kids being adequately tall but not at their, potentially tallest is a problem.
This study points out that the growth of vegetarian children was adequate, but less than average. I wonder how people would react to a doctor saying, your son won't be as tall as he could be, but don't worry, his height will be adequate.
So to test what I've learned's consistency, we have to ask, is it okay if breastfed babies aren't going to be as tall as they could be as formula-fed babies? If he is cool with it, then why is he not cool with it in the case where vegan kids don't get to be their, top-end height?
In fact, there are all kinds of compounds only found in meat that we currently assume are not necessary to have in the diet. Things like creatine, carnosine, anserine, taurine. There's evidence that each of these have beneficial effects. Just to look at two, this 2002 paper argues that taurine may be essential in certain circumstances, and creatine supplementation has benefits for brain function in adults like improving memory, intelligence, and mood, and it reduces the negative effects of sleep deprivation. Further, creatine is transferred from the mother to her baby during pregnancy, providing several benefits to the baby.
All right, so another thing needs to be made clear. When What I've Learned says that there are all kinds of compounds only found in meat that we currently assume are not necessary to have in our diet, understand that you can literally make the same argument for literally any food component. For example, what if sulforaphane is essential? And to be clear, I've touched on creatine, carnosine, anserine, taurine, and whether they are essential before, and if they have any potential benefits. I'll have that video linked in the description. Now, what about that taurine paper from 2002 that he cited? He argues that taurine may be essential in, quote, certain circumstances. Those circumstances being premature infants requiring, wait for it, total parenteral nutrition, which, if you don't know, involves all synthetic nutrients being put into an infant, or supplements. This is not a common circumstance at all, and the infant is already being fed synthetic nutrients, they're just also being fed taurine. So if he's cool with taurine supplementation, then I get to say, okay, well, what about, vegans getting taurine from supplements? Even though, by the way, it's not clear that we need it, but whatever. Oh, and also just understand that the reason the infant is in need of synthetic taurine is because they're premature and can't create their own taurine. Now, what about the paper he cited on creatine? In that paper, subjects were being supplemented with 5 to 20 grams of creatine. You would need to consume a kilogram of beef, or about 2.2 pounds of beef, to get that 5 grams minimum of creatine. So think about this real quick. All of these papers he cited rely on supplementation. Yet earlier in the video, What I've Learned mentions our being victim of nutritionism, which he defines as the idea that we need food-specific components as opposed to whole foods. The findings of these papers, which he supposedly deems as good sources considering he cited them, suggest that yes, chasing individual components of food actually works. Take, for example, the taurine paper and the creatine paper. In both papers, it was found that consuming the nutritional components of foods resulted in benefits.
The other thing is reality versus theories. In theory, you could take a retinol supplement, a B12 supplement, a zinc supplement, an algae-derived DHA supplement, a kelp-derived iodine supplement. You could take a vitamin D supplement or eat a ton of UV-exposed mushrooms. Then you can make sure that your plant sources of iron and calcium are low in oxalate. You could take substantial amounts of soy or pea protein powders to make up for the fact that most plant proteins are poorly absorbed and have lower amounts of amino acids, and so on and so on. But the reality is that the average person doesn't want to spend time worrying about nutrients. Again, meat is so nutrient dense that you can get a decent amount of well-absorbed zinc, iron, selenium, choline, various B vitamins, vitamin A, calcium, and other nutrients just eating a crappy cheeseburger. Ideally, people shouldn't eat crappy cheeseburgers, but the average busy person doesn't have time to craft the perfect meal.
A decent amount of nutrients from a cheeseburger? If you plug in 3 Burger King Whopper cheeseburgers, then before exceeding 2,200 calories, you'd be deficient in vitamin B5, B6, A, C, D, E, and minerals like copper, magnesium, manganese, and potassium. But hey, at least you get 4 grams of sodium and 42 grams of saturated fat with your 3 extremely nutrient-dense cheeseburgers. Something that also needs to be understood is what the term nutrient density means. Nutrient density is the measure of the nutrients a food provides relative to the energy it provides. The more nutrients per calorie a food provides, the more nutrient dense it is. Here are 2 examples of calculating this. Skim milk delivers about 85 calories with its 300 milligrams of calcium. To calculate the nutrient density, divide milligrams by calories. So 300 milligrams divided by 85 calories equals 3.5 milligrams per calorie. Now do the same for fresh turnip greens, which provide 15 calories with the 100 milligrams of calcium. You take 100 milligrams of calcium divided by 15 calories and you get 6.7 milligrams of calcium per calorie. So in this case, it'd be fair to say that in regard to calcium per calorie, fresh turnip greens are more nutrient dense than skim milk. And something hilarious about all this is that wheat is considered more nutrient dense than beef. Here's the nutrients for 2,500 calories of whole bagels and 2,500 calories for ribeye. Amazing. So next time you see a carnivore say that beef is the most nutrient dense food on the planet, just send them the nutritional profile of bagels.
Ideally, people shouldn't eat crappy cheeseburgers, but the average busy person doesn't have time to craft the perfect meal. Convenience is important. This is evidenced by the fact that a 2021 paper found that the more people avoided animal products in their diet, the more they ate convenient, ultra-processed foods, with vegans eating the most processed foods.
And yet another instance of what I've learned showing us that he doesn't read his sources properly. Amazing. He mentions convenience ultra-processed foods, but links a paper where the reason vegans seemingly ate more ultra-processed foods, and to be clear, not convenience foods, was that the authors classified meat alternatives in plant-based milks, like soy milk, as ultra-processed foods. The difference was so tiny as to be entirely explained by that classification. What I've learned also failed to mention that vegans ate more unprocessed foods than omnivores. And this is all very bizarre considering what I've learned has said in the past concerning vegans and the healthier user bias. He says here that the reasons vegans have better health outcomes is healthy user bias.
The second point is the healthy user bias, which says that people who are likely to do a vegetarian diet, which is thought to be healthy, are also likely to do several other things that are thought to be healthy, like not smoke or get plenty of exercise.
So are they eating too many convenience ultra-processed foods, or are they eating so healthy that they come across as healthy because of healthy user bias? Amazing.
Looking at the updated Impossible Burger ingredient list, they basically swap the animal protein with soy and the animal fat with sunflower oil and coconut oil. And they throw in several other vitamins to mimic the vitamin profile of meat. Eating tons of processed soy protein and vegetable oils like sunflower oil is totally new to the human stomach.
All right, so he says that eating tons of processed soy protein is new to the human stomach, yet it's associated with better health outcomes.
Sunflower oil seems like a simple swap for animal fat, but they are totally different. Many animal fats can be a good source of vitamin K2, but vegetable oil in fact hampers the activity of vitamin K, making you need even more.
And in response to what he said about, many animal fats can be a good source of K2, the only studies he cited on the benefits of K2 were using doses above 400 milligrams per day from supplements. And we already covered in part 1 how poor the amount of K2 in animal foods is and how it isn't even bioavailable.
The information about soy-based foods, it's been so confusing. Is it good for us? Is it bad for us?
The hormone disrupting effects of increased soy consumption is somewhat controversial, but it may explain why a study on almost 8,000 boys found boys born to vegetarian mothers had a higher risk for a specific deformity in the genitals called hypospadias.
All right, guys, okay. This paper did not even assess soy nor isoflavone intake, so I'm not sure why he is citing this paper to help support the notion that soy is problematic in regard to hypospadias. This would be a slightly reasonable thing to do if soy was the only vegetarian food there was, but turns out it isn't. Shocking.
Soy has this plant-based estrogen, isoflavones.
Men think about the estrogen effects as well.
Soy contains the isoflavonoid genistein, which a 2022 meta-analysis found has detrimental effects on the male reproductive system.
Alrighty, guys. This paper is a meta-analysis on preclinical studies. Preclinical studies are on non-human animals. It turns out that humans are not non-human animals. It seems like what I've learned just partially read the title, but didn't get to the part mentioning that this meta-analysis was on preclinical studies. Amazing. So it's either that or he thinks we're rats.
Lastly, Impossible Burger has tried to make their product taste meatier with something called soy leg hemoglobin from the roots of genetically modified soy plants. GMOscience.org writes that a 28-day study on rats commissioned by Impossible Foods in 2017 on soy leg hemoglobin found that soy leg hemoglobin caused statistically significant changes in weight gain, changes in the blood that can indicate the onset of inflammation or kidney disease, and possible signs of anemia in the rats.
So I went over to the original source, GMO Science, for this claim about the findings and what happened to these rats. But when I went to the actual paper, I found the opposite. It said there was no mortalities, clinical observations, ophthalmology, body weight gain, food consumption, or food efficacy changes attributable to hemoglobin prep administration for either sex. Additionally, there were no test substance-related changes in hematology, serum chemistry, or urine analysis parameters for males or female rats. And if you want, you can pause now and read the rest, but pretty much nothing substantiates what they said. And you can read these too. Pause now.
Further studies did eventually persuade the FDA to designate leg hemoglobin as safe, but Impossible Foods admitted that a quarter of their new ingredient was composed of 46 unexpected additional proteins, none of which were assessed for safety in the dossier.
This part is very weird because What I've Learned actually cites this tweet from Impossible Foods, but fails to mention what they said in defense. The tweet says the 46 proteins are from Pichia pastoris, a non-toxic, non-pathogenic yeast, and, quote, unknown protein simply means that scientists haven't yet figured out its physiological function. If you analyze beef or any other food, there will be many of, quote, unknown proteins found. It's also weird that he called these unexpected proteins as opposed to unknown proteins. What's an unexpected protein? Didn't know that was a scientific term.
This is another big issue with trying to replace animal foods. The replacement almost always comes with plenty of other stuff. Kidney beans need to be soaked and cooked to reduce the lectin content. Certain people can still be sensitive to the trace amounts of lectins in properly processed kidney beans.
Yeah, so very easy solution here. Don't eat kidney beans raw. Crazy. Also, he talks about sensitivity to the trace amounts in properly cooked beans. Beyond the no citations, there is no detectable lectin activity in beans soaked for 12 hours and cooked for 30 minutes to an hour, depending on variety. In other words, just normal ways to cook them. And similarly, no activity for unsoaked pressure cooked beans. The time it takes to deactivate the lectins is below the time it takes for them to be even soft enough to eat. And at least compared to beef, beans give you a warning when they are not cooked properly. If you haven't destroyed the lectins, then they are not cooked through, generally. And they'll taste and feel awful. Meat doesn't do that. What's also interesting is that chicken alone kills more people in the US per year than the suspected cases of people that have been killed in the UK in 13 years from kidney beans. And not confirmed cases, suspected cases.
Phytic acid found in beans, seeds, nuts, and grains inhibits fat digestion and the absorption of calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc. How much? Well, this study found that about 35% less zinc is absorbed in a vegetarian diet. Fiber itself worsens the activity of pancreatic lipase, which is important for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, and K2.
So the studies he cites for these claims are just unbelievable. The first study seems to be an in vitro study, which is very low on the evidence hierarchy. The second paper on calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc digestion being inhibited by phytic acid is on rats. Some human health outcome data would be nice. The third paper is the paper we covered in part 1 of my debunk that said the less bioavailability of zinc and iron from phytic acid have no functional consequences. And the paper for fiber worsening the activity of pancreatic lipase is an in vitro study, which again is very high on the evidence hierarchy.
A high intake of goitrogenic plants like cabbage, kale, and turnips can interfere with iodine functioning.
Yeah, there was just no citations for this claim in his script. Let's keep going.
This nutrient challenge is part of the reason why the German Nutrition Society in 2016 and the French-speaking pediatric HGN group in 2019 recommended against a vegan diet for adolescents, children, or mothers.
Okay, so 2 problems here. It is cherry-picked, as most organizations say that vegan diets are fine as long as they're balanced. And number 2, it is cherry-picked even in the countries he chose to cite. French dietary guidelines and German ones both recommend limiting meat if it's eaten. The fact that they say if it's eaten implies that meat is not essential.
Several studies have found that babies born to vegan mothers have a lower birth weight compared to babies of omnivore mothers.
Okay, so these studies generally found negligible differences, and pretty much everything cited by him attributed these low birth weights to inadequate versions of vegan diets, mainly including lack of B12 supplementation. Also, here's a quote from one of the sources he cited. And this quote is just another one of those quotes that indicate he has not read his sources properly. It should be thus concluded that vegan diets are appropriate for pregnant and lactating women only if these women habitually use reliable B12 sources, preferably oral supplements. Again, he cited this source, so we can only assume he thinks that it's a good source. So I guess what I've learned actually thinks that vegan diets can go through when it comes to your pregnancy, as long as people are supplementing properly. Amazing. Another one of his sources stated that the marginally smaller size in vegetarian newborns was essentially due to mothers not being as high in body fat and wasn't associated with any morbidities of being small for gestational age. And you know how he thinks that B12 supplements may not work as well as animal foods? Well, one of the studies he cited clearly showed B12 supplementation working. The women were B12 deficient, and soy milk fortified with B12 fixed this for all participants. Of course, he wasn't aware of this when he was trying to establish that B12 supplements don't work. Yet another instance of cherry-picking findings in studies from what I've learned.
This study points out that the growth of vegetarian children was adequate, but less than average. I wonder how people would react to a doctor saying, your son won't be as tall as he could be, but don't worry, his height will be adequate.
Whoa, big surprise. What I've learned left out important details of the study. Let's see what they are. What I've learned does not cover how the height of the vegan children in the study appeared to level out at around 10 years of age. He also left out the potential explanations by the authors for the initial difference in height between vegans and the reference group. These include the possibility of vegan children consuming low-calorie dense foods in their weaning phase, which can obviously be resolved by consuming higher calorie vegan foods. Also, the low income of the studied population leading to a less variety of foods, and the higher degree of breastfeeding than bottle feeding in the vegan population compared to the reference population. And again, this is ironic considering what we discussed earlier about bottle-fed infants being taller than breastfed infants. In this case, the the vegan mothers were more likely to breastfeed over bottle feeding, which could have contributed to the infant's shorter height. And here's what the authors considered as the most important potential explanation for the findings. The third and perhaps the most important possible explanation for the differences between the farm and the reference population involves the intrinsic irregularities in the current reference growth curves. The National Center for Health Statistics / Centers for Disease Control reference consists of two populations: the FELS data of children from Yellow Springs, Ohio for ages 0 to 24 months, and the US representative data for 2 years of age and older, with the noted differences in height between the two populations. If the reference population were free from these irregularities, the observed differences in height for age between the study and the reference populations would be smaller at the younger ages. Again, why does what I've learned not include these details when sharing papers trying to substantiate the notion that vegan diets don't work? He either doesn't properly read the papers, reads the papers but withholds this information from his audience, or reads the papers but is too lazy to include the important information in his video. Given how in-depth his editing is for his videos, I doubt it's laziness. So he's either incompetent, dishonest, or both. Amazing.
This begs another question. What is the difference between enough nutrients and the optimal amount of nutrients? When you look at a nutrition label, it will tell you what % of your requirement for a nutrient that you're getting. This is called the RDA. But it's not set based on the optimal amount of that nutrient you should get. It's set based on determining how much is enough to prevent a deficiency. And then they recommend to get a little bit more than that. For example, that study on choline that I mentioned earlier found that pregnant women getting twice the RDA had beneficial effects on their babies. The adult RDA for vitamin D in the US is currently 600 IUs. However, the Endocrine Society suspects that not even 1,000 IUs would be enough to provide all the health benefits associated with vitamin D. They recommend about 3 times the RDA for adults, 1,500 to 2,000 IUs. So this isn't only a criticism of a plant-based diet. Obviously, the average person's omnivore diet needs to drastically improve. And nutrition isn't the only reason people choose to be vegan, but cutting out nutrient-dense animal foods doesn't seem like a move in the right direction for health.
So just gotta say that cheeseburger diet he mentioned earlier that was so nutrient dense would not meet this vitamin D RDA. And let's remember what he said at the end of this most recent clip. Everything he is saying here can also be said about omnivorous diets. However, he uses what he says here to bolster the idea that cutting out, quote, nutrient dense animal foods does not seem like the right move, insinuating that if we want to get optimal levels of nutrients, cutting out animal foods would make this all the more difficult. But perhaps what I've learned doesn't realize is that by increasing animal product consumption for hitting the supposed optimal intake for some of the nutrients he has named in this video, he could be bringing himself farther from the optimal amount of nutrients needed for certain nutrients primarily found in plant foods. Take vitamin C, for example, or phytonutrients found in plants in general. The main point here is that what he is saying can work both ways. And as I keep saying, what does anything he's just said have to do with disproving that vegan diets can work?
For 99% of human history, we relied on animal foods for nutrients. An animal food containing diet has a strong track record that spans arguably over 1.7 million years. Various cultures viewed animal foods as important to growth, and despite the challenging circumstances they lived in, they were protected from infectious and chronic disease. And they enjoyed proper growth in their body, faces, and mouths.
Alright, so he didn't provide a source for the claim that none of our ancestors had our modern diseases of civilization, but here is a source suggesting that they did. And just a reminder that he referred to what constitutes diseases of civilization earlier in the video as heart disease, cancer, osteoporosis, diabetes, and so on. And the source I just provided shows evidence of cancer in our early ancestors. And as discussed before, he has survivorship bias to contend with when trying to worship the health outcomes of our ancestors or hunter-gatherers, and attributing their health outcomes to the foods they eat as opposed to them just being a fit population.
With that in mind, a plant-based diet is an experiment without any meaningful track record.
Especially when it comes to kids, I think it is a very risky thing.
It's been a couple decades at best that people have been doing purely vegan diets, yet so many people are already quitting for health reasons.
So he says here that a plant-based diet is a diet without any meaningful track record. He followed this up with saying, it's been a couple decades at best that people have been doing vegan diets, yet already many people quit for health reasons. His evidence for this claim are anecdotes of ex-vegan hypochondriacs and that 84% vegans quit study that everybody cites. So here is the pyramid one last time to understand how unreasonable it is to consider these ex-vegans anything more than uninformative when it comes to this topic. And one last time, let's look a little bit more into that 84% study. What's what's interesting is that if you actually read into the study, you'll find that the vast majority of people who quit weren't even experiencing ill health. What's also interesting is that 76% of the people who quit never had their B12 levels checked, and 26% of the people who quit said that they weren't regularly taking a B12 supplement or consuming fortified foods. Perhaps less people would have experienced ill health if they supplemented what they needed to. So what I've learned is evidence to support the claim that many vegan people quit for health reasons are ex-vegan hypochondriac anecdotes and a paper that found that the vast majority of people who quit were not experiencing any health effects. Amazing. Also, just to be clear, I totally think it's possible that a person could be on a vegan diet and quit because they had sincerely been experiencing health ailments. But that does not mean that vegan diets inherently come with health ailments. It's just possible to do a very shitty version of a vegan diet. Now let's see if the claim that the vegan diet is just an experiment with no meaningful track record holds up to the evidence. I want to start with the Adventist Health Study on vegetarians, which included vegans. If we take a brief look at the study, we see that the study involved 73,308 participants after certain exclusion criteria. The goal of this paper was to evaluate the association between vegetarian dietary patterns and mortality. The participants were broken up into 5 dietary pattern groups. They were non-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, and vegan. Oh, and let it also be mentioned that this paper adjusted for confounding factors such as sex, race, geographic region, personal income, educational level, marital status, smoking, alcohol use, exercise, sleep, menopausal status of women, hormone therapy in postmenopausal women, dietary energy, and BMI. What they found was that vegetarian diets were associated with lower all-cause mortality, with some reductions in cause-specific mortality. And the subset of vegetarians that were vegan had a significantly reduced risk in both sexes combined for other mortality, and in men for all-cause mortality, ischemic heart disease mortality, and cardiovascular disease mortality. In this paper titled Vegetarian Vegan Diets and Multiple Health Outcomes, a systematic review with meta-analysis of observational studies, the conclusion states that this comprehensive meta-analysis reports a significant protective effect of a vegetarian diet versus the incidence and or mortality from ischemic heart disease and incidence from total cancer. It goes on to say that the vegan diet conferred a significant reduced risk of incidence from total cancer.
So at the end of the day, science is a promising story of progress. Maybe one day we'll learn enough to make a sufficient plant-based replacement for animal foods. But I don't think it's happening anytime soon.
We already have. As demonstrated in part 1, B12 supplements work, fortified plant foods work. What I've learned, just decided to cherry pick garbage data to support the claim that they don't. All right, guys, that is the end of the video and the end of my entire critique of what I've learned's extremely misguided and error-filled video saying that vegan diets don't work. Thank you so much for watching. If you support my work and want to support me on Patreon, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment and you get early access to my content, and you can message me one-on-one through Patreon. It would sincerely mean a lot. These videos take so much of my time up, and supporting on Patreon only helps me have more time to work on them, as opposed to have to work on them while balancing other things like other jobs, etc. So please consider supporting. And if you don't know, I do have a book going over most, if not all, of the anti-vegan arguments you're gonna hear online. If you wanna get that as well, that'll be linked in the pinned comment. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude.
Fuck off, I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
Even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who is your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude.